You are muted, so you'll have to unmute. Okay. Okay, so people are arriving. That's great. Good to see everybody. Give people a little more time to get everybody in the room before we get started. Okay, give people another few seconds. I think most people are in who are in the waiting room. All right. And yes, okay, it's fine. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Carolina Valdivia. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Criminology, Law and Society here at UCI. Her work explores how various forms of legal and social exclusion impact the lives of immigrant youth and their families. And this is important for us in education because we need to be thinking about children in their broader context and how this affects their educational trajectories, their mental health, and political participation. Today, she's going to be talking about her research, which encompasses 3 different projects. And the title of her talk is Understanding the Experiences of Undocumented Students and Identifying Ways to Support Them. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Peña, for the introduction. Let me go ahead and share my screen here with everyone. Okay, share. Okay. Are you able to see it okay? Okay, perfect. So yes, thank you. Thank you once again, Dr. Peña, and also thank you to the organizing committee for bringing us together. I'm really excited to be able to share a little bit about my work in progress and then also to connect with everyone during the Q&A and afterwards. So for today's remarks, I wanted to share a bit of the work that I have been doing since 2017 as part of 3 separate but related projects. And the first of this data, or this data set is what I collected between 2017 and 2019. And so during that period, I conducted observations and interviews with 103 members of undocumented and mixed status families in San Diego, California. And I'm currently writing a book manuscript, and it's tentatively titled On the Verge of Separation, based on that data. The second project is the Undocu Research Project, for which I'm the co-principal investigator, along with Dr. Marisol Clark-Ibanez, who's a professor of sociology at Cal State San Marcos. And for this project in particular, we have been working closely with a team of 30 folks since 2017, and we've collected over 80 in-depth interviews with undocumented high school students, as well as the school personnel who work with them. And this project also entails observations in classrooms across 8 different high schools. And the project is still ongoing, and it's also based out of San Diego, California. And then the third and most recent project, which is the Family Reunification Project, entails in-depth interviews with 80 individuals who either returned to the US post-deportation or they have a family member who did. We recently finished data collection in the state of California. And so right now we're just in the beginning stages of data analysis, coding, and writing. And I'm happy to talk about any of these projects during the Q&A. But for today's presentation, I wanted to focus on a specific segment of participants from the first project, namely undocumented students. And then that way I wanted to discuss some of the key challenges that they encounter during their educational trajectories in the context of immigration enforcement. And so this is going to include a discussion on the consequences of parental deportation, but then also the vulnerability that students experience after those deportations and even in the absence of a deportation. It will also include unique forms of care and resistance that individuals are employing when navigating those hostile terrains, both at the family and community level, and in ways that also necessitate the support of educators and counselors. Before I dive in, I do want to highlight that we are currently living in what sociologist Tania Golash Poza conceptualized as a contemporary wave of mass deportations. And so this chart here helps you to visualize the number of deportations that have been conducted by immigration and customs enforcement officers during the Bush, Obama, Trump, and more recently, the Biden administration. And so notably, this area of mass deportations reached its peak under the Obama administration when more than 3 million migrants were deported. And so from the existing literature, we know that immigration enforcement affects the entire family. For the person who's deported, first and foremost, trying to adjust to a life in one's country of birth post-deportation often entails economic hardships and housing instability. People typically assume that if you've been deported, it's because you committed a crime. And so that stigma can make it very difficult for folks to find employment and housing. And given that Latino men are the primary targets of immigration enforcement, we also know that deportations lead their spouses who remain in the U.S. to become what's been conceptualized as suddenly single mothers. And so overnight, mothers often have to work more jobs or more hours to be able to provide for their families. And part of my work reveals also the critical role that young adults play in the aftermath of a loved one's deportation, which I'm going to discuss in a bit in today's presentation. So the other thing, though, before we dive into the findings, is that even the mere threat that a loved one could be apprehended, what's often talked about as deportability. So even one's deportability can affect one's mental health. When it comes to children of undocumented parents, for example, we know that even the fear of deportation can lead to increased feelings of anxiety and depression. And those circumstances can make it difficult for children to be able to sleep and also be able to concentrate at school. And so ultimately, we know that at least 16 million people are affected by immigration enforcement as members of undocumented and mixed status families. And the term mixed status families here typically refers to families where at least one member is undocumented. And so for my current book project, I'm looking at the consequences of immigration enforcement through a legal geography lens. And so for me, this entails paying close attention to where and how the law is implemented. And more specifically, my work is addressing the following research questions. One, what are the specific places that undocumented young adults and their families have come to associate with heightened immigration enforcement, and then subsequently an increased risk of apprehension? Two, what are the strategies that families employ in order to be able to navigate this landscape of enforcement? And three, what are the consequences that this reality has on family members' daily routines, their mental health, as well as their participation at school, work, and the household? And so to address those questions, between 2017 and 2019, I conducted participant observations and in-depth interviews with 103 members of undocumented and mixed status families. Just very briefly, there was variation across participants in terms of their immigration status. So as you can see here, 43 of the folks that I interviewed identified as individuals who were able to access deferred action for childhood arrivals. And so under DACA, its recipients are able to both secure a temporary work permit and then also temporary relief from deportation. And DACA is something that folks have to renew every 2 years. And so it in some ways it does afford some level of protection and stability, but at the same time, because you have to keep renewing it every 2 years and the program itself has been threatened, and it's currently pending litigation in the court, there's still a lot of uncertainty that folks experience even with something like DACA. And also, I should note that there was variation in terms of contact with the enforcement apparatus. And I'm also happy to talk more in the Q&A why making these distinctions is important for how we understand the impact of enforcement. But I just wanted to sort of point out right now that, for example, here you could see that 29 of the folks that I interviewed were individuals who lived with that threat of deportation. 22 had experienced either themselves were detained or somebody in the family was detained. And then 24 of the folks that I interviewed had been deported or had a loved one who had been deported, and that person was in their country of birth post-deportation. And so this is just to give a sense of the folks that I interviewed. But the first theme that I wanted to talk about is this abrupt transition into adulthood that happens after an undocumented student's parent has been deported. So one thing that I find is that once a parent is deported, that severely undermines both parents' ability to participate in the family in many aspects. And so this includes financially as well as emotionally. And I highlighted the word parents here just to emphasize that both the parent who's deported and the parent who's remained in the US are deeply affected. So for example, the physical taking away of a father can definitely lead the mother to stop driving or working for fear that they too may be apprehended. Or in some of the other families that I interviewed, what happened is that after a father was physically taken away because of a deportation, the mother, who remained in the US, nevertheless experienced heightened levels of depression and anxiety, which prevented them from carrying on with their daily lives. And so that also made it difficult for them to be able to take care of their children or complete household chores. And just to give you an example, I do have here a quote from one of the young adults that I interviewed. Her name, or the pseudonym that I used for her, was Vanessa. And she is a 27-year-old community college student whose father was deported back in 2011. And she is the oldest of 4 children. So during the interview with Vanessa, she explained how her father's deportation in 2011 had led to her mother's emotional withdrawal from the family. So she mentioned, when they deported my dad in 2011, that's when it was really downhill, because she, so her mother, used to always take care of the kids and everything. But when my father was deported, she couldn't support them. It was just, he was the breadwinner, so she gave in to the alcoholism. And during my interview with Vanessa, she explained how her mother had begun to drink a lot following her father's deportation, and this quickly began to interfere with her mother's well-being. And so during one day, Vanessa was visiting her siblings, and this is when she realized that their mother was nowhere to be found. She had actually left the children in a room on their own for 2 days. And so Vanessa shared that in that moment, she immediately went ahead and grabbed them. And then she said, I showered them, I took them to eat, and then I took them to their school. And that's when the school started questioning me about my mom. They were like, where's your mom? Why haven't they come to school? And that's when I broke down and told them about the alcoholism. But I didn't think that they were going to call Child Protective Services. And here I should note that during the interview, Vanessa shared how, because of the struggles that her mother was going through, she did try to access different forms of support and resources for her mother, but because her mother was undocumented, but then also because they weren't earning as much, so they didn't have a high and stable income, a lot of the resources that could have been available were not available for her mother because she was ineligible, either because of immigration status or because of the level of income that those resources required. And so then this her own, like her deteriorating mental health and well-being ended up interfering with her ability to take care of the younger children. And then I should also add that during the interview, I learned that once Child Protective Services got involved, they ended up removing the children from the home. Eventually, also Vanessa's mother was deported, and Vanessa actually hasn't been able to see her mother since then. And she's not too sure about her whereabouts, although she knows that she was deported to Tijuana. She doesn't know quite like what happened after her deportation, and because Vanessa has DACA, which doesn't allow her to travel outside of the United States, she's not able to go there and find her mother once again. And so this is like one particular story, but overall what I find is that as a result of these changes that are happening at home, that are both here we're talking about separations that are both physical but also legal and emotional. So what ends up happening is that as those changes are happening at home, young adults like Vanessa end up taking on a wider range and greater number of responsibilities to be able to fulfill both parental roles. And here, birth order really matters. And so parental responsibilities most often fail on the older sibling. And then also gender really matters. What I found is that the distribution of responsibilities follows a gendered pattern. For example, oldest daughters often became responsible for taking care of younger children, cooking and cleaning, while the oldest brothers became responsible for contributing financially and disciplining younger siblings. And from the literature, we do know that children of immigrants fulfill some of these or other responsibilities from a very early age, most notably serving as cultural or language brokers. And what's different in this context of deportations is that one, new responsibilities are introduced. And so young adults, for example, are having to find a loved one post-deportation or securing housing for them, sending them money. And then two, young adults are tasked with assuming a greater number and wider range of responsibilities to be able to fulfill both parental roles. And then three, this is all done under a period of heightened uncertainty and stress. Vanessa, for example, further reflected during the interview on how drastically her life had changed, starting from the moment her father was deported. So then she said, I was hurled into all these responsibilities and all these really hard decisions that people shouldn't make so young. So it went from that to like, where am I going to stay while I send money to the kids? Or when they got sick, every day it was a stress about whether they are eating. I didn't realize how much work my mom put into raising all these kids. So it was kind of like I became a mom overnight. And so this brings me to another point. With regards to the consequences that deportations have on young adults' educational experiences and trajectories. And so that is that young adults' educational level, when the deportation occurred, also plays an important role. For those who are in middle school, for example, as these abrupt changes were happening at home, some of the main challenges for children become the following. So one, children experience trouble concentrating and difficulty completing their homework. Also, they experience or parents are unable to be involved in their children's education. For the parent who's been deported, it's physically impossible to be involved. But a lot of the times it's also difficult for the parent who's remained in the US also to be involved. And that's because of the fear that they could too be deported. And it reduces the time that they spend outside of the home or driving. And it also often led them to feel like they should go into hiding. And then the other challenge is this inability to tell others about the deportation of a parent and the challenges that they're going through at home for fear that Child Protective Services or immigration officers will become involved. Sonia, who is a 28-year-old DACA beneficiary, and she had graduated from college, explained or talked a little bit about that first challenge. She shared, my younger sister literally sleeps next to her, so their mom, in the same room. And my mom would cry and it would just be a domino effect. She would just not focus on her school. Since I had the teacher's email, we would just email each other. And she's like, hey, I think your sister might need therapy. And then I asked her, may I ask why? Like, what do you see? What do you mean by that? And she's like, well, there's just moments where she's working on math and she'll just cry out of nowhere. And then so this is sort of what happens when, if we're in the context of a deportation for children, if the deportation happened when they were in middle school. If the deportation occurred while like the young adult was in high school or in college, it's a little bit different, that in that by this point, they might have already established a trusted number of mentors that they can confide in for help and support. And so if they're struggling with their classes, they could at least tell someone what's going on at home. But however, given that they're at a critical stage where they're transitioning into adulthood, then the increased responsibilities and also the added stress and pressure more often can lead young adults to consider dropping out of school. And again, this is especially the case for the oldest brother or older sister who has to make this choice between working in order to be able to provide greater support for the family post-deportation or staying in school. Here I have a couple of quotes. So first is Luis, whose father has been deported 5 different times. And he said, I actually dropped out of community college and I started working more. I would work 6, maybe 7 days just to make sure I had enough. And then same with Vanessa, she said, I always felt that pressure has always been there to take care of the kids because I'm the oldest. When the whole thing was going on, I just automatically was like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And so I did choose that over school, which is why I didn't continue college. And here, I just wanted to also mention that in this context, educators and counselors actually play a critical role in identifying ways to support undocumented students and their families. So some of the young adults, for example, describe mentors who encouraged them to stay in school, connected them with others who've gone through something similar, refer them to resources on campus. And this could be things like counseling, emergency housing, financial assistance. But one of the single most important ways that educators and counselors were able to help is to position themselves in the classroom or the school more broadly as individuals who can be trusted. And so in this way, undocumented students know who to reach out to for support during the times when they are most in need. And I did publish part of these findings in an article with the Harvard Educational Review in case anyone is interested in learning more about it. And in the book that I'm currently working on, I am expanding on these themes to show how many of these changes in some ways can also begin to unfold long before an immigration arrest, but then once the deportation happens, they're exacerbated. And these changes can also happen even in the absence of an immigration arrest. And again, with conditions worsening over time in ways that require undocumented students to make greater contributions to the household at a relatively young age. And so part of what I find and discuss on the book that I'm working on is that families are constantly navigating a hostile landscape of enforcement that's threatening to separate them, not just physically in the event of a deportation, but also socially, legally, and emotionally. And these conditions affect individual family members' well-being, their routines, and participation across social institutions. Many of the undocumented students that I spoke to, for example, mentioned instances of heightened levels of fear, anxiety, and stress in response to the location and the timing of immigration activities. Carmen, for example, who's a 19-year-old college student with DACA, was especially worried about her father's vulnerability to apprehension when he had to commute for work. During the interview, Carmen shared that There's still some nights where I stay up really late until 4 a.m. and I hear my dad leave and I start getting really anxious and panicky because I'm scared that something might happen. And I worry, is he going to make it work? And then also, so this was a common thread and a pattern that I saw in many of the interviews and how enforcement impacts their well-being and their feelings of anxiety and fear. Um, and the other thing is that it also impacts their routines, with respondents either leaving to school and work either earlier or later in order to avoid leaving their homes when immigration officers might be outside. And so Esmeralda, who's a community college student with DACA, um, during the interview, she was talking about immigration officers and how they would park right outside of the apartment complex where she lives. And so she shared that as a result, several people changed their schedules. They called their work and said, I have to go in later because I run too much risk. The other thing is that in addition to enforcement impacting their mental health and their routines, it also impacts undocumented students' decisions about where to attend for college. Several of the undocumented students that I interviewed expressed that they felt compelled to only apply to universities that were close to their home. One, because they were concerned about the presence of federal immigration checkpoints, such as the one that's located between here in Orange County and San Diego County. And second, because they felt that in the event that their parents were arrested by immigration officers, they needed to be close to home so that they could help. And so there you have an instance where undocumented students may be qualified and in fact very interested in attending a college or university that's further away from home, whether that's in the state of California or even elsewhere in the country, but who are nevertheless having to apply to colleges that are within their area. So for the folks that I interviewed, they were limiting their options to the San Diego region. Because they were first and foremost concerned about their own ability to travel outside of the federal immigration checkpoint, but then also they were primarily concerned about their loved ones, and thinking about what might happen if one of their parents is arrested and subsequently deported. Before concluding, I do want to emphasize various forms of care that are unfolding at the family level. And so young adults, for example, often volunteered to accompany their parents or they offered to drive. This was especially the case for those who had been able to benefit from having a driver's license. And so that included folks who had DACA or US citizenship. The other thing that young adults did is that they were constantly checking in with their loved ones just to make sure that they were safe. And this was especially the case when there were reports about potential immigration enforcement raids in the neighborhood. And so ultimately, families are constantly shifting their routines, their routes, schedules, and responsibilities. And young adults play a critical role in this process as they're drawing on either their legal protection as DACA recipients or US citizens, or their resources or knowledge about navigating different social institutions. And so the three key takeaways that I hope my work can help us think through more deeply are: one, the active role of the state, law, space, and social actors in producing this hostile landscape of enforcement; and two, the profound psychological toll that's associated with this landscape, that's evinced in part by individuals' changes in routines, their well-being, and their literal nightmares. And this is an area that I explore in greater depth in a chapter in my book, but I didn't get a chance to touch on during the presentation just for the sake of time, but happy to sort of tease that out a bit more in the Q&A if folks are interested. And then three, the possibilities of being able to reimagine the use of space in a way that prioritizes forms of care and solidarity over enforcement and policing. I'll go ahead and end here so we have enough time for questions. But again, I'm happy to discuss any of these key takeaways in greater depth. And thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much for this really important and powerful talk. We do have time for discussion and for questions. If you have questions, if you would put them in the Q&A, I can go ahead and read those out, and then we can start with those. The first question is, when can we access this recording? And I'll have to see about that, but the school will have the recordings available. Thank you. Well, while we wait for questions, and if you put them in the chat, I can deal with that too. I just like to have them in one place. But anyway, if is one thing that you talked about is community members like teachers and other community members providing some supports, and you touched on a couple of things, but can you expand a little bit on those?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the things that were really helpful on the side of educators and counselors, one was being able to position themselves as allies to the undocumented community, and that can be done that was done in multiple different ways. So one example was educators who would have undocumented posters in their offices. And so it'll be posters that say like, we support undocumented students. There's different templates that folks can use, and those are usually accessible online for folks interested. But sort of like having symbols in your office to sort of communicate to students, like, I'm somebody that can be trusted. And if you have any questions, like, feel free to reach out, especially. And so that was something that educators did a lot, especially because it wasn't as though they knew who in the classroom was undocumented. And so for them, it was like, okay, at least let me be somebody that folks can trust, and they can come to me if something were to happen. Other things that they did is that they would include on their teaching materials, such as like their syllabus or assignments, like information about resources available for undocumented students. And so again, it's just, in what ways can you incorporate messages of support for undocumented students in the classroom? And so that's sort of like what happened at the individual level to create this supportive environment. Other things that educators and counselors would do is they would help host immigration related workshops, whether this was things like Know Your Rights workshops, where parents were invited to come and they would have an opportunity to learn more about like what to do in the event that immigration shows up to one's home or workplace. What are your rights in that context? There were also instances where counselors would put together panels of undocumented students who've gone on to college. And this was particularly like at the high school level to try to raise awareness and also forge those connections and networks between undocumented high school students and undocumented college students. And so that's a little bit of like more on the practical side, what can be done to support undocumented students.
Yeah, a lot of the questions are around what kinds of supports can we provide, and what supports can classroom teachers provide and school districts provide. There is one question: can you provide background context for how many undocumented students are at UCI, or size of the population, and how we can support them? So this would be college level.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I would have to check back with the UCI Dream Center to see what the latest stats are, but I do know that out of all the UCs, and this is something that stood out to me when I first learned it, is that out of all the UCs, UCI actually has one of the greatest proportion of students who are in mixed status families. And so even though like they might be US citizens, their parents are undocumented. And so there's a large proportion of students who may not be undocumented, but have a parent who is.
Thank you. And another question is, what is the best way we can support our undocumented peers?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it also reminds me a little bit about like like the type of support that educators and counselors can provide. So I think I will be answering both of these questions a bit more. One thing that I find really stands out and is really helpful for undocumented students, and this is something that I incorporate into my work as well, is that even if you don't have all the answers, and so with immigration, it's a very complicated, also quickly changing landscape, especially because here we're talking about immigration policy at the federal, state, local level, and also at institutions. And so it can be a lot to sort of know what the landscape looks like for immigration policy and enforcement. But even if you don't have that full picture, I think one thing that's always really helpful is to let undocumented students know that you'll either figure it out with them along the way, or you'll connect them with somebody who might be able to help them. And so if you do end up being the person that you sort of help them and guide them along the way, it does entail having those initial conversations about how you can be of support for them, and then also a lot of like having to search online for different resources that are reliable and that folks can access to just be able to identify more information, um, or being able to also like connect them with somebody else. And so even if you don't have all the answers, you're sort of signaling to them like, okay, here's somebody else who might, or let's figure this out together. And that goes a long way for folks who are undocumented, because they've trusted in you to provide support and help. And so they it's sort of like a reminder that they don't have to go through this alone, that as challenging and as challenging and as fearful and concerned as they may be, understandably so, because of the context of immigration, they don't have to go through it alone, and you're there to support them along the way. And so that's like one very concrete step that's more at the emotional level, that just to be able to connect with folks.
Yeah, thank you. Here's another question. Hi, Catalina. I'm wondering if in your data, anything came up about the relationship between schools and CPS or schools and ICE. In Texas, CPS and ICE often target children while they're at school. Is there any information about this in California schools?
That's a great question. So I'm still trying to tease that out, the extent to which immigration is collaborating with agencies like CPS, also like the DMV, because there's certainly ways that they're collaborating and some of it, at least right now, some of it depends on like the particular or like who ended up referring families to immigration officers. And so it seems as though the reporting begins either at the school or with another agency like the DMV is another big one that's coming up in my work. But it's something sort of that I'm trying to tease out more. There's no concrete information so far that I've been able to find about the extent to which they're both collaborating. But I know that there is a feedback loop there, and that they are collaborating in ways that are harmful for families. It's really difficult to get a straight answer. Yeah, and part of it is because of the type of secrecy that ICE maintains over their enforcement practices. So that's part of the challenge, but I'm working to try to figure this more.
And there's another question also about support. So this is thinking about supports that a school district, for example, might provide versus individual teachers.
Yeah, so at the school district, some of the things that we saw, and this is more so with the Undocu research project that I mentioned, were things like issuing statements in support of undocumented students. And this we saw a good amount when the Trump administration had first been inaugurated. And so we saw some of those statements. We did see school districts that didn't issue a statement, and part of that was because of the neighborhood that they were in, and it was much more conservative than the other neighborhoods. And so there was some tensions there that led to schools ultimately, or school districts ultimately, not releasing public statements. But certainly that was one thing. The other thing is that they're at the school district level, they're able to partner with community organizations or with legal service providers, or even with immigration lawyers, to try to bring in those resources at their different schools that they oversee. And so definitely connecting with those organizations that are already doing the work on the ground is just making sure that those resources are made available and accessible for families.
Thank you. Are you aware of community or campus resources for impacted students or staff?
Yes, so I would definitely, I mean, I love and I would recommend the work of the UCI Dream Center. They're constantly putting together workshops, training, fellowships for undocumented students. So that's one. The other one would definitely be the undocumented student-led organization on campus, Sapphire. And so both of those, I would say, would be amazing starting points at UCI more specifically. Because we're part of the UC system, the other resource would be the UC Immigration Legal Resource Center. And you can also learn about them through the UCI Dream Center. But what's really helpful about that is that if you have any students who are undocumented or in mixed status families, they can get access to legal services through the UC Legal Resource Center. And so that could be for things like, let's say students are wondering if they can apply for DACA, or they need help renewing their DACA, or they have questions about their parents' immigration status and whether they can try to help adjust for them. Any questions like that, like students can consult with the lawyers from the UC Immigration Legal Resource Center.
Right, thank you. In the Q&A, there's also a note about Sapphire and that they're on campus. They hold weekly meetings on campus. They're included their email, and they're on Instagram as well. So if you want to seek out those resources, I think those are other resources for our audience. Another question is, do you see a lot of DACA students in the AS Criminology Law and Society program?
That's a good question. I haven't, because I just started at UCI, I haven't gotten a chance to connect with students in the MAS program yet. I've certainly connected with undocumented or undergrad students, and yeah, I mean, my sense is that at the undergraduate level, there's definitely a high proportion of folks who identify as undocumented or from mixed status families or as allies. And so there's definitely also like an interest from folks to provide greater support for undocumented students, even if they don't have like the personal lived experience. But I wouldn't know necessarily with the MAS program in specific.
Here's another question. I'm not sure if this was already mentioned, but what was your experience in contacting and connecting to the individuals that participated in your research?
Yeah. Great question. And I feel like methodology, I mean, I'd love to just talk more about how I went about data collection and the type of relationships that I built with folks. So one of the things that I should mention is that because I've been doing immigration related work and organizing in San Diego, California, where I grew up, I've been doing that, or the organizing, since about 2011, maybe earlier, back when I was an undergraduate. And so part of that work was me being involved with undocumented student-led organizations, with organizations like the San Diego Dream Team, which was affiliated with United We Dream, which is one of the largest immigrant youth-led organizations at the national level. And so through that work, I have done my share of organizing Know Your Rights workshops, DACA workshops when it was first implemented. The other thing I didn't mention is back in 2011, I created the website myundocumentedlife.org. And so through that website, it serves as like a national platform for undocumented students and their families to be able to just learn more about the type of immigration policy changes that are happening at the national level, also the type of resources that are available. And I started it back in 2011, but now the blog has more than 2 million views. And from folks from all across the country, folks who are students, parents, educators, counselors. And so all this to say that because I've built these networks and relationships with folks for a long time now, when it came time for me to recruit, like those relationships were helpful because folks already knew of the work that I was doing. They knew that I was someone that has been doing this work for a while and that they could trust me with their experiences. So that definitely helped, especially because as I mentioned, I started conducting interviews in 2017 when the Trump administration had just been inaugurated, when folks' fears of deportation were even more heightened. And so it was really important for me to sort of like communicate to folks some of that work that I had already done, but then also my commitment to continue doing that work. And I also took several, like at least 10 different steps to protect people's privacy and confidentiality. Some of it entails using pseudonyms for any names of people, schools, neighborhoods, etc. Other things include making sure that I secured a certificate of confidentiality from the NIH, so that if the data were to be subpoenaed, I have that certificate to protect the data. And so it's a lot of different steps that I took to try to ensure folks' privacy and confidentiality to the best that I could from my end. So it was those sorts of things that I think were really helpful when I began connecting and conducting interviews.
All right, thank you. Here's another question. Are you aware of any scholarships, grants, or financial support outside of those that are available through the Dream Center? This is someone who's trying to support students financially or ways to support students financially.
Yeah, great question. So on the blog that I mentioned, the myundocumentedlife.org, we do try to post like scholarships and with their upcoming deadlines. So that would be sort of like one place to look for that. But also other organizations at the national level who do similar work would be Immigrants Rising. They have like an Excel sheet where you could look up the scholarships that are open to undocumented students, and they break it down by state and by deadline. And so that's another helpful and reliable resource. I'm trying to think of others, but I would say those two are sort of like a good first start.
Great. What was the second one? The name of the second one? Immigrants?
Immigrants Rising.
Okay. Immigrants Rising. Thank you. All right. Let's see. Could you tell us, I'm squinting because it's small. Could you tell us more about reimagining the use of space?
Yes. Definitely. And this is something that like I'm diving into much more in the book. But one of the things that I want to highlight is that or part of like part of what I'm doing in the book is teasing out where enforcement is taking place. And so there's several reports from families who have seen sightings of immigration officers outside of their apartment complex, or in the roads that they take to commute to work or school. There's also very specific stores that are getting targeted, very specific public roads and neighborhoods. And so it's sort of like trying to map out where enforcement is taking place in San Diego. And one of the things that's also happening in San Diego is that there are community organizations that are trying to both document what's happening on the ground and then also contest the use of space. And that's sort of what I'm teasing out in the final chapter of the book, because essentially what's happening is that you do have organizations like Unión del Barrio or Alianza Comunitaria in San Diego, who the minute that they learn that immigration officers are in a shopping center, for example, organizers will get dispatched and they'll go there. And so these are volunteers who are going there. Usually it happens at like 5, 6 in the morning when officers are monitoring and conducting arrest. And so volunteers will go, And one of the things that they do is they bring out megaphones and they start alerting the community nearby, like, hey, immigration is out here, don't come out of your doors. And that way folks know. But the other thing that they do is that they record what's happening. And so that's really powerful, because oftentimes when an immigration arrest is happening, it's happening in the shadows in many ways, because it's happening in the or early in the morning at like 5 or 6 a.m., like I mentioned, or officers are often wearing plain clothes, driving regular vehicles. So unless you're undocumented and sort of like attuned and mindful of your surroundings, it can very well look like just regular people driving regular cars. And so it's easy to sort of like normalize it and not see it. But part of what the organizations are doing is they're saying like, hey, we're documenting what's happening. We're also raising awareness about what's happening. And so sometimes they'll live stream like an arrest that's happening, and then community members will show up, provide support. What ends up happening is officers don't want that type of attention, so they'll end up driving away. And so for me, like that's one instance in which is essentially community organizations reclaiming and reclaiming that use of that space, and to the extent that they're contesting enforcement practices that are happening on the ground. And that's like one example, but I'm trying to think creatively about how space is being used, what it means for families directly affected, and what are different possibilities.
Right, thank you. I think that there are no more open questions. I don't know if anybody else has any other questions, but thank you so much. This was such a great learning opportunity for our community. And you can see, I think, the appreciation of everybody for your talk today. And I want to thank you, and I look forward to hearing more from you and more about your work.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Right.
Thank you for having me, and thank you also for attending and your questions.
Absolutely. It was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And with that, I'm going